sorry about the confusion earlier. I guess I want to try to get the right PowerPoint presentation. Although my talk actually is going to be different than what's on here. I thought I'll do two things at the same time. We can reflect a little bit through the writings and the sayings and verses maybe on Islam and the positive aspects of it. While I'm talking about racism, there's only one quote here which is part of a definition that that maybe is part of my talk, and the rest is not. So if you get bored with my talk because it deals with the conceptual framework, you can always look at the screen. So first I would like to acknowledge the fact that we are on Indigenous land, the Fort William First Nations. I would like to thank the organizers and particularly the president of Matawa, Darius Ferris, and Carol Odette, the communications manager. I had meaningful conversations, likewise, as you were saying, with both of them last week, and I do appreciate the fact that the Matawa First Nations organized such a noteworthy event and came up with these important themes for our gathering today, which revolve around unity, peace, and understanding. I do believe that faith-based values, among other approaches, can definitely be part of the solutions to societal and systemic racism. I was asked to speak on the issue of racism and to problematize it, which is quite difficult to do in a few minutes. As a start, I would say that we certainly need to incorporate the above themes so we can have a meaningful dialogue and work together as a community in a peaceful way through a solid understanding of our issues and the challenges we face. Since my talk involves a conceptual framework, and because of the time constraint, I will speak in a general way, so hopefully what I'm going to say will make sense. Please raise questions if certain things are not clear. So we will start first with the working definitions that you saw, and I'll talk about it and maybe highlight some aspects of it. Racism can be defined as those ideas and ideals, between parentheses, ideologies, so think of dominant perceptions or assumptions in this case, that assert or imply the assumed superiority of one social group over another, together with the institutional power to put these perceptions into practice in ways that control, exclude, or exploit those racialized as different and inferior. So I mean, that existed at the blatant level, historically speaking, and even up till the 60s. And from the 60s onwards, it started to change. So now it's more on the subtle side, but nonetheless, these aspects in terms of dominant perceptions and assumptions, how they get infiltrated within our institutions, so they link to the power aspect where certain people are included and others are not. So although this definition then is essential for analysis and evaluation, however, how this happens is not that simple and often is not visible to everyone involved. Because the reality is often complex, shifting, and contextual, right? You need to look at the social setting itself. Hopefully the following discussion, although it is going to be brief due to the time factor, will nonetheless shed a bit of light on some of these issues. It should be stated that we have come a long way from our racist history, in which racism and racialization existed at the level of policy making, ideology, and practice, and we can go on and on talking about that, but we won't, right? I mean, the policy itself was racist, and the practice was racist, and the dominant perceptions and assumptions were racist. With respect to our Indigenous people, we know now more than ever before, through royal commissions on Aboriginal peoples and through the findings of numerous studies and the work of many Indigenous groups and agencies, including at the local level, about the intergenerational effects of this troubling colonial history. Although Indigenous writers indicate that some of the colonial elements are still continuing, they're still there, especially in relation to Aboriginal people, But at the same time, they stipulate that we have been slowly moving in the right direction by addressing and delivering on issues that are important to indigenous peoples. I mean, starting from the 70s, we started to move in the decentralization type of direction. It seems that recently there has been more receptiveness by people and reps of our governments at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels, especially after the findings of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Having said that, however, many of us know that we still have a long way to go to be able to get rid of the systemic racism. It should be emphasized that racism or racialization is quite complex, especially the systemic nature of it and its links to the structural, economic, cultural, ideological factors and the element of power and their historical roots. So again, one can talk quite a bit about this, but maybe it would be good for discussion. So we won't go there. Our roles in resistance and critical reflection should be viewed within the embeddedness then of the systemic and the institutional, as well as the cultural, ideological forms of racism and ideological forms of racism. So I mean, it's not just systemic, it's also institutional, it's also cultural, it's also ideological, right? And of course, there are all kinds of academic definitions on this, we won't go there. So beside then these, or I should say, beside these structural factors that reflect dominant biases, stereotypes, and assumptions, which are constructed within the binaries of the us and them, call it binaries, call it polarization, call it a split, call it a division, whatever you want to call it. Within that binaries of the us and them, the superior and inferior and good and bad, our roles should be also viewed, in addition to that, within the democratic principles and democratic ideals of justice, rights, equity, and fairness, and whether we are able to act on them and apply them. Putting this in concrete terms, our thoughts and conducts, whether as representatives of institutions, and this is at the formal level, whether we look at it in terms of education, the economy, the media, and the law, and the rest of the system, and the police, and so on, or outside of these institutions, the role we play are impacted by the above sets of factors, the democratic ideals and the dominant biases, and assumptions, including image formation and language. I mean, you can go also on talking about that. And there are links to the aforementioned binary split of the us and them, superior, inferior, good and bad. Of course, most of us strive towards applying the democratic ideals, while we are at the same time being confronted with other influences stemming from the biases mentioned above. Hence, our thoughts and actions don't occur in a vacuum outside of structural factors and arrangements, including the good as in democracy, and the bad as in biases, and bad assumptions that generalize about the reality or about members of ethnocultural groups or other social groups or groupings. Think, for instance, of the stereotypes and their impact on us with respect to how we think and act, and how the stereotypes might predispose individuals to act in a particular way. So I mean, you have extreme examples on this, whether in the US or here, in terms of how the police treat members of racial minorities and so on. However, we are not necessarily passive, being confronted with these two sets of ideals, if you will, the democratic ones and the biases at the level of what is dominant, assumptions and perceptions and so on that are problematic. So we play a role, but our role is usually in relation to the above, to what is around us. Some of us also try to change what is around us, right? I mean, like what we're doing here, for instance. I would argue here that critical thinking and critical reflection can help us move in the right direction, and some of us do that anyway. So what I am saying here is that we need to look at our roles within the social setting and the social context and not outside of it. I will also argue that if we are knowledgeable and we follow the right approach that shows understanding, the very aspect that was referred to in wisdom, we can change what is around us and achieve harmonious existence. It is definitely possible. Portrayal of our city or our citizens and our representatives in a simplistic, reductionist and rigid way, such as, that they're racist or sexist and so on, does not help us understand the reality with its complexities, including understanding root causes or processes or problems, and doesn't help us to move forward. It also overlooks the resistance and the struggles of the members of various groups, including Indigenous people, and their roles in fighting racism. Right? So, the Star, for instance, had an article about Thunder Bay, and also other media outlet that paint Thunder Bay in a particular brush in a simplistic, reductionist way, but it doesn't show what people are doing, have been doing, and their struggle and their resistance and so on, which is important. Additionally, repeating and reproducing stereotypes, false assumptions and perceptions about members of any group also does not help us to work together as a community, right? Whether reps of the system about social cultural groups or the other way around as well doesn't help us to move forward as a community. So similarly, reproducing the dominant dichotomies of us and them and good and bad, superior and inferior, which are well entrenched, will not help us to move forward either, right? And the boundary, the binaries are drawn for us. Often we fall into these binaries, and the way we treat things, we treat them in a very simplistic way anyway. And in terms of either or, they're never contextualized, and history hardly takes part of the analysis that we follow. So I would argue, however, that most of the reproduction and or reconstitution of these problems don't necessarily happen directly, intentionally, or consciously, right? They're not necessarily, especially at this point in time. There is the blatant nonetheless, and there is the intentional and the conscious, but often they're at the unconscious level and unintentional level, mainly because of the embeddedness of the systemic nature of some of our problems, right? That they become taken for granted. So without good understanding of the complex reality of our issues and problems and the challenges we're facing and their root causes and historical links, we will not be able to solve anything. I will talk a bit on the processes, because sometimes this gets overlooked. So the processes in terms of what we do and how we do it, including how we apply policies and approaches, and would say that they need to be critically examined as well, so we can deconstruct and shed light on the how and the what and the why and the where and the when. Right? If we don't do that, we're not going to be able to move forward as well. So critical evaluations of these processes must also include delving deep into the intentional and the unintentional, the conscious and the unconscious aspects in order to be clear about the nature of a particular problem and to be able to respond accordingly. An example on processes, sometimes we might have a good policy or approach that is supposed to help us to do our work in an equitable way, but the way we do it, that is the process itself, might not give rise to an intended good outcome. We want to get rid of racism, but then the way we carry about doing this, it might reproduce more racism. Just to give another example. So we need to be careful not to fall into reproducing these polarizations and to make sure that what we do is not done in a confrontational way either. And the confrontations are created for us. Whether you look at it in terms of binaries or outside of this, the us and them and the superior, inferior, and so on. That is, we should be careful not to fall into such a trap. I would say that this is quite possible. And we at the Diversity Thunder Bay, with the Thunder Bay Multicultural Association and the Thunder Bay Indian Friendship Center, and their members, obviously, the members of these groups, were able to work with the Thunder Bay Police for 4 years on institutional change. And we had good relationship. But because we moved away from the confrontation, and we tried to figure things out, because we looked at the problem as a community problem. So we're smart if we get together and do something about it, and we're dumb if we say, no, this is not my problem here in this institution, or not my problem there, and so on, or it's about a few bad apples, what you hear often. We are all impacted by what is around us. And if we don't work together and understand the systemic nature of the problem, we're not going to be able to move forward as a community. And of course, that understanding was reciprocated also by the police members too, at the executive level, I should say, right? Because this is what we were dealing with, first and foremost. So to summarize, I would say that if we want to move forward as a community, we need to have good understanding of how complex our world is. We need to move away from the simple, reductionist and rigid ways of viewing our issues and problems. We need to also move away from the binary split mentioned above, and to make sure that we don't reproduce them. We need to also exercise a lot of critical thinking and reflection. I mean, one of the things that I kept saying, even when we were dealing with the police, is that if we can get the officers and what have you to critically think and reflect on their conduct on a day-to-day basis, and if they adopt this to be part of their approach, then we've done a lot. Although many good things came out of our work with the police, including the training component and so on. And evaluating the policy, which was like 2,000 pages. I mean, we had consultants to work on this, and the employment system reviews and so on, right? So a lot of critical thinking is needed and reflection, and to show wisdom in how we approach a certain issue and how we're going to tackle a particular problem. I mean, often we know what needs to be done, but the approach that we follow is wrong. It's not wise, right? So how are we going to do it? How are we going to articulate it? How are we going to communicate? And how are we going to tackle it? How are we going to change? If we don't have that understanding and the wisdom and peace, I would add, which is what I also jotted down. So our collective efforts and our peaceful ways, guided by various religions and spiritual elements, among other factors or issues, will hopefully lead us to the right path to be able to yield positive outcomes. So again, dealing with analysis is not easy, right? Especially towards the end of the day in this case. So hopefully I made some sense. Thanks for listening.